Welcome to the Doctor's Life podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dianne. Think of the podcast as a mobile doctor's lounge where we take some time out and explore topics that doctors are interested in related to what it means to be a doctor in today's world and creating a rich, satisfying, and meaningful life, as well as making the healthcare system better for doctors and patients. So, if you are a doctor, you'll feel right at home, and if you aren't a doctor, you'll get a better understanding of doctors and what we think about and talk about. I know you will enjoy the conversation. Let's jump in. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Life podcast. I'm so happy to have you all on today. We are going to be talking about a subject that we haven't talked about before, but is really important for us to discuss. It's kind of a silent topic, as we'll delve into a little bit more. We're going to be talking about loneliness today. And my guest is an expert in this, as well as someone that I've come to know and really admire. We met at a conference a few months ago, just emphasizing again for you guys that getting out there and meeting people, building your tribe is really important. And so I had such a great opportunity to meet our guest today. Her name's Dr. Aparna Iyer. And she's a board-certified psychiatrist and adjunct assistant professor at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. She specializes in physician wellness, perinatal mental health, and integrative psychiatry. And when I had the chance to meet her, she actually did a wonderful, interesting, and provocative talk on loneliness as it pertains to physicians. So I definitely had to have her as a guest on the Doctor's Life podcast today. Hi, Dr. Aparna. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, it's so great to have you. So, as always, we ask all our docs to talk about how they got into medicine and how they came to be doing the work that they are doing today. So, we'd love to hear about you and your journey.
Oh, thank you. So, I started getting interested in medicine predominantly because my mother is an OBGYN. What she did was really cool. She was an advocate for women. She was an advocate for wellness, and she took a lot of pride in her work. She really was protective of her patients, and it felt like such a powerful thing for her to be able to do, both as a woman, as a minority, a woman of a minority ethnic group, but also just generally speaking as a physician with the lifelong learning and her cool clinical practice. I thought that it was just wonderful. So that's really what got me interested in medicine in the first place. I did consider a lot of other sort of equally nerdy endeavors. I thought about becoming a professor in math, or I thought about doing women's studies, but ultimately ended up pursuing a career in medicine.
Awesome. So what made you decide to go into medicine as opposed to these other nerdy fields that you were describing?
Actually, I think that it was a love of psychiatry that made me pursue this path, because what I really wanted to do was impact people's lives in the deepest, most meaningful sort of way that would create a long-lasting sort of change. I had pursued an undergraduate degree in psychology, which started the gears turning. And the more I met with psychiatrists and started shadowing them and asking them about what they did, it made me feel like I could see myself doing this lifelong.
That's fantastic. And you've been practicing for a long time now.
Yeah, for almost 10 years. Most of that actually was I've done a lot of therapy and a lot of wellness work, but I have worked with physicians for pretty much most of my career.
Awesome. Well, we are kindred spirits. You have your profession in psychiatry, and my jam is physicians, wellness, and personal development. So I know that we have a lot in common. We think about the same things a lot of the time. Let's talk about loneliness. This is a really interesting topic to me, because it seems like a paradox that doctors are wanting to engage with people. As a matter of fact, when I talk to most docs, they feel as though they were called into medicine to care for others. A lot of our practice, at least for most of us, is dealing with other people, and we're surrounded by other people at work and at home. So, how in the world can doctors feel lonely when they're surrounded by people all day long?
Well, it's absolutely true. When you go into a hospital, you are seeing patients. Most of us are seeing patients around the clock, and you're surrounded by nurses and other doctors, administrators, patients' families. And then at home, many of us are married or have partners and children. So it might seem a little bit ironic to say that these are the same people who often also complain of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
But actually not, because we're really talking about two different things. The number of social contacts that you have in no way really relates to whether or not you're lonely. Loneliness is more of a subjective experience. So you could be surrounded by millions and millions of people every day and still feel lonely. I think that what really kind of struck a chord for me was hearing celebrities talk about feeling lonely, which made absolutely no sense to me because they have fan clubs, they have people around them who adore them all day, every day.
Right.
But it really is about a subjective experience of feeling disconnected from other people, as opposed to being socially isolated or socially around other people. You could have maybe one or two social interactions with other people every day and not feel lonely, versus somebody who could have thousands of interactions with various people throughout the day and feel very lonely.
Just so that we're clear, is in our discussion moving forward, what does loneliness look like? What are the manifestations of loneliness?
So, loneliness, like I had said, is more of a subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
People feeling a lack of connection from other people. And a lot of people who, I think it's hard to really kind of profile who looks lonely and who doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
because when we talk about manifestations, really, you would think that maybe someone who has fewer social contacts would be lonely, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, a lot of times the people who are lonely are people who are married, who have a lot of social contacts. But people who tend to be lonely a lot of times can be, I think in a poll that they did recently, they had said that people who tend to be lonely tend to be Caucasians, tend to be people who are not parents, people who have they tend to have more stresses in their lives. Those are usually the people who are complaining of loneliness.
Mm-hmm. So, why is loneliness important? I mean, there's times in life where we feel, we can feel lonely, we can feel alone. And I think that, well, as physicians, we tend to brush everything that we feel off. But it's important not to ignore these feelings of loneliness. Why is that?
So, intermittent feelings of loneliness is one thing, but I'm really talking about pervasive, long-standing feelings of loneliness. In fact, this has become a sort of epidemic, especially in Western countries. In England, they have an entire government department dedicated to dealing with loneliness as a public health issue, because they understand that there are major mental and physical health ramifications. It's a big deal because when they're looking at loneliness, there have been several studies that demonstrate that it is an independent risk factor. I guess you could say it's associated with major medical and mental issues such as depression, anxiety. It is associated with higher morbidity and mortality, to the equivalent of smoking and obesity.
That is amazing. So it's not important just so that you feel better to have social connections. It's actually integral to our health and well-being.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that something that feels a little bit ironic is that society progressively is kind of boasting that we're becoming more and more aware and inclusive. Plus, with the widespread use of the internet, we would in theory, be more connected to each other. But in actuality, I'm not so sure that that's the case. I think that there was a study that was done several decades ago, I think it was 1980, where 20% of Americans were complaining of feeling very lonely. That study was repeated in the last few years, and now it's 40% of Americans. So the percentage has doubled, despite the fact that we are, in theory, more connected through the internet.
Right. Yeah. I think the next question would be then we talk a lot about physician wellness and physician burnout. And of course, I met you at a conference about physician burnout. So, how does loneliness contribute to burnout?
So it's hard to know exactly what the path is. We know that there's an association. So studies have shown that when we explore kind of what are the characteristics associated with the physicians or physicians in training who are complaining of burnout, the majority of them will also complain of feeling lonely. So there is a relationship somewhere in there. So if we were going to look at loneliness and understand how exactly it contributes, you have a lack of social connections. There is this feeling of isolation, and it's harder to have that support to kind of help you and boost your resilience through some of the adversity that we experience or some of the difficulties we experience as physicians.
Yeah, I mean, I remember times definitely, especially when I was in residency, I'd be on trauma call. And so I'd be tired and doing these like 36-hour shifts. And not only did you feel tired, but you kind of felt, at least I did, I did feel isolated because I was newly married. My husband was a resident too.
No.
Even though you had the camaraderie of the other residents around you, I think some of the things that I was experiencing were just so profound that it was hard to feel as though I could connect and talk about them. I was at this level 1 trauma center, and we would go and see, gunshot wounds and people that got stabbed. And, it was just some horrible things that were difficult to share, even with the other residents. I mean, you kind of did, but it felt more like we're just, slapping each other on the back kind of thing, not really connecting. And then I would go home where my husband was, and maybe we hadn't seen each other. There was a time at which we weren't seeing each other for 4 days at a time because I was on call and he was on call. And so even in the middle of it, you could get home from that shift and just feel like I really like someone to share with, but there isn't anybody. And then that's when that loneliness would set in, just as an example from my own experience.
I have to tell you, that is not an uncommon thing that I hear, because we are working as physicians, a lot of times working side by side with each other. We're kind of facing in the same direction, but not necessarily facing each other and sharing in our experiences and supporting each other in the way that we need to. I can't imagine what that emotional burden is of seeing gunshot wounds and seeing, all kinds of horrible traumatic things, and then having to just kind of swallow it and move on to the next patient instead of stopping and saying, wow, this really was an emotionally moving, difficult experience. And then being able to connect with somebody else. Really, the work environment in medicine is not built so much for us to kind of share in those difficult experiences and process them together in a way that would foster that sort of support within our groups, but more to just kind of work alongside each other. And in some ways, I would almost venture to say that not only are we working alongside each other, we are oftentimes pitted to kind of feel competitive with each other.
That's an interesting discussion there. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, so I think that medical school, of course, is difficult to get into. So we are all competing with a pool of other really amazing candidates for a small number of seats for medicine. And then once you get into medical school, many of us are aware that there's this bell curve, and many of us are going to end up being at the bottom of the bell curve. Some of us are going to end up being at the top. And so just with that curve by itself, you know that not all of us can be number one. And so I think a lot of times that carries into our career. Plus, not to mention that in medical school and residency, think about residency, you had your attending, you had your chief resident, you had your intern, the medical student. It almost feels like there's a hierarchy. And I think that also carries into the workplace. I can't tell you the number of times that a physician would come in and say, "Oh, I really am struggling with X, Y, or Z, and I want to reach out to this person, but she's a senior member of my group." And so there's something almost untouchable about her. I can't connect with her because she's somehow superior to me on this hierarchy. But in actuality, that person's probably struggling too and would appreciate that sort of connection. But something about medicine and the culture of medicine, I think, lends itself to a sort of hierarchy or a sort of competitiveness that I think can bar us from really creating those connections with each other. The other thing I want to mention is that, and I'm not sure that this is necessarily specific to medicine, but when we're talking about women physicians, we are entering into medicine and feeling like, understandably, that there is not much room for us in leadership positions. There's not much room for us at the top. And so as female physicians in particular, many of us can feel competitive towards each other to compete for these few number of spots that somehow it's conveyed to us that women are not often seen in leadership positions, and we have to compete with each other for those few spots that are there.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that, and that does make sense. And I can see where that would contribute to that feeling of loneliness and isolation. In some ways, it's almost like a protective thing where you may not want to reach out to someone who they'll get the one up on you if you don't show weakness.
Yeah, because if you start to say like, "Oh, I'm struggling with this," or "I'm struggling with that," instead of looking at it like, "Oh, well, this is me reaching out so we can create camaraderie and support each other," understandably, it could feel like you are exposing a vulnerability. And in an environment where we are like kind of geared to be competitive with each other, that's the last thing you want to do. And so how then do you turn around and say, "Oh, let me be friendly with this person"? It doesn't work so easily.
Right. Speaking of that too, we've been talking about, I started a conversation about, as I was sharing my experience about having struggles and not feeling as though I could share them readily or as much as I wanted to at times. But we're also talking about not just sharing our struggles, but sharing our successes and sharing our lives, so to speak, with each other. I don't get that the medicine environment really encourages us to share much about ourselves. What is your take on that?
I absolutely think that's true, especially when the thing that you want to share is how you're struggling. I really do feel that we are many of us have the mindset because of the culture of medicine that we have to somehow be stronger than that and superhuman. In the interest of full disclosure, I had struggled with some postpartum depression with my first child. And especially being a psychiatrist, I believed that I should be better than that. I should have known better. I should have seen it. There was so much shame. I didn't want to let anybody know, especially other psychiatrists, because I was worried I would be seen as lesser than. And I see that quite often with my physician patients, that they will say that they don't feel like they're able to kind of express some of the difficulties that they're having in their group because of feeling vulnerable. And really, like I was saying, I don't feel that the culture of medicine is necessarily conducive to that.
Yeah. And I would say too, just in terms of, I think of that competitive feeling, or the wanting to connect versus getting ahead. They almost seem like they are in contradiction.
Absolutely.
But sharing your successes and is part of encouraging each other as physicians too. We want to be models of success and inspiration for each other. But if you don't feel as though you can do that openly, or you can share your struggles, but you can't share your successes, or vice versa. It's almost like, it could be like sort of like this Facebook phenomenon at work, right? Where you're just sharing like all the great stuff that's happening, but, sort of these Facebook moments, but underneath some stuff is going on that it would probably benefit you to talk about it. And it would also benefit the others in your group. We find that a lot of times if one person, as you were saying, one person's struggling with something, it's probably someone else is too.
I absolutely agree. And I think that sometimes it can help to just make that first move, because probably if you're feeling lonely or you're struggling with something, the chances are that other people around you in the same work environment are struggling with something similar. And I think that if you take that first step to make that connection with somebody, more often than not, it will be reciprocated because other people are looking for that same connection. I have to tell you that in my work, what has been one of the most interesting things that I've noticed is that sometimes I'll get a physician who will come in from a large group, and that person might say, I feel so isolated. Nobody's interested in making friends. Nobody's interested in connecting. They all have their own groups of friends. They're all confident. I'm the only one who feels like I'm struggling. I feel like an imposter. I feel lonely. And then later in the day, I'll have somebody else in the same group who comes in and says the exact same thing. So clearly the message is getting lost here, and I feel like people often are struggling with the same sorts of things, but we don't have the opportunity to connect over that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the structure of medicine, how it doesn't necessarily support these relationships, but we're strong individuals and we know that we can create change if we
Yeah.
want to. We certainly made the argument that we should try to combat loneliness. Combat isn't really the best word, but that's the word that I could think of at the time. But we can overcome loneliness, let's say, by taking action. And you have some suggestions as well as an example of some action that you've taken. So we'd love to
Yeah.
hear about that.
Well, when it comes to medicine, I think we can all agree that there needs to be some big picture cultural changes that need to
Mm-hmm.
occur. We really can't look at ourselves or expect all the physicians to be kind of superheroes. We're all human at the end of the day.
Right.
But aside from the cultural changes of medicine, if we were going to talk about individual steps that we can take as physicians, I would suggest that to combat loneliness, really to reach out to one another. If you have found that you are interested in making a connection with somebody else, to take that first step and try to reach out to that person. Really sort of working within your group and kind of making that connection and kind of getting that support within your group, I think would be great. But there are other ways in your personal life as well. You don't necessarily need to have, as I'd mentioned, thousands of friends. You could have a couple that are meaningful. So if you have social connections already, to really start to work on those. And that doesn't necessarily need to be with other physicians. So if you have a spouse or a close friend, to deepen that relationship, I think is the best place to start, with your children, with your parents. So meaningful relationships, kind of work on deepening those and connecting more with the people who are already important to you. But if you don't really have a lot of social connections, or you're looking to increase the number of ones that you have, and then, there's other ways. So really kind of throwing out a line and reaching out to other people within your professional group. Or if you would rather reach out outside of your professional group, there are meetups. There are charitable groups where you could connect with people who do have similar interests, even outside of medicine, and work on building relationships there. I think that one of the questions I often get is about virtual relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the era of the internet, what is the value of a Facebook friend? And I would say that these relationships that are built online are not bad. I don't want to say that they are bad or meaningless, but I think that there is no replacement for face to face time. So, building a relationship online and then following it up with face to face time, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's basically it's getting back to basics, and It seems so simple, and it can be a challenge in our busy lives to connect with the people that we love face to face, the people that aren't immediately around us, like our immediate family. But I completely agree that that time, that's what, I know it sounds really kind of really old school, but at the end of the day, that is what keeps us going. And that's what, among other things, but that's one of the major things that, in my opinion, gives us meaning in our lives. Where it might be, some of us might want our patients around us at our bedside when we're dying, but most of us want the people that we love around us. It's just paramount that we don't get so carried away in our work and in our busyness that we don't forget to slow down and be with the people that we care about.
I absolutely agree. And I think that you and I probably have both experienced this, as have many of the people who are listening, that when we get busy with work, it is so hard to maintain that balance. And a lot of times as physicians, when we're trying to strike that balance, it can be very easy for our own needs and our personal lives and our relationships to kind of take a back seat and work take center stage. But really trying to maintain that balance, I think, is key to building resilience, key to buffering yourself against burnout as much as possible, key to your mental health. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is.
Yeah. And it's fun. It's good for you. Like, it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's okay for us to do things that are fun and good for us. I think in our culture, we tend to think like that everything has to be hard, but it's okay to take it easy, kick back with the kids or your spouse, your friends. That time is just as important. And it's so rejuvenative to do that. I teach that to my clients as part of my physician vitality recovery system. I think it's one of the most important pieces. As a matter of fact, there was a recent study that was about physician wellness, physician burnout. And, we talk a lot about physician burnout, the causes of physician burnout. We've done so much studying on burnout that it's starting to feel that is the only conversation. But we want to shift to physician wellness, and they found that what are the factors in physician wellness? And the top 3 factors in this study that I had read were all related to relationships and
absolutely
connection.
And because we as physicians are notoriously poor taking care of ourselves. I don't know if you had read the study that was done, I think, somewhere in Scandinavia, where they say that 80% of physicians will go to work and just kind of push through illnesses for which they would excuse other people from going to work. Like, say, the flu even. We'll go to work if we have the flu and we feel like we're dying. but if our patient says, should I go to work? I have the flu. We would say, oh, of course not. You should take some time off to take care of yourself.
Right.
But we don't extend that grace to ourselves. So we don't take care of ourselves. And a lot of times, if we look at how something can have ramifications on our professional lives, it really speaks volumes to us. So the reality is that a burned out physician is not able to care for the patient as well as a non-burned out physician. So relationships, resilience, wellness, this is all central to not only maintaining your personal health, but also in terms of maintaining a healthy professional life and good patient care.
Well said, Dr. Aparna. I completely agree with you. Do you have any last thoughts for our listeners today?
You had asked me to mention my own steps that I've taken with regards to connection and camaraderie, so I did not bring that up. I am relatively new to Dallas. I've been in Dallas for approximately 2 years. When I first moved here, I was quite lonely and feeling very disconnected. I'm a solo practice psychiatrist, so it's not like I have many other psychiatrists that I work with on a daily basis to connect with anyways. So I really had to take the effort actively to make those connections. When I looked around, initially I thought I'm the only one who feels lonely. Everybody else has these connections. But the more I started to speak with other physicians I would happen to come across, I realized that they were having similar experiences of feeling disconnected and lonely as well. So I put together wellness and support groups for physicians, not knowing how it would be received, but they were very, very well received and people were excited about them.
Mm-hmm.
So these sorts of groups have taken off here to the point that I can't always accommodate people who want to come because I have a small office. That's basically the reason. But it's been great because my goal is to build a tribe and to create that change in my own small way in terms of the culture of medicine, where we can talk about the things that make us feel unwell and talk about the things that we're struggling with, but also talk about what helps us grow and foster that growth in each other.
I love it. And I can see where that could easily spread to many organizations. It's a model that's been described and tried, and we know that that works. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Well, Dr. Aparna Iyer, it is so awesome to have talked with you today about loneliness. I think at the end of the day, loneliness is something that is important for us to address. It's something that we can absolutely take care of for ourselves. And in the process of it, we can help others as well, furthering our relationships in our personal and our professional lives can do nothing but good in the world. So thank you again, Dr. Aparna.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, if someone would like to get hold of you, find out more about what you're up to, how can they do that?
They can kind of check out what I've been reading about, writing about, and thinking about, because all of that is on my blog and on my website. So www.draparnaiyer.com.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the best way, but I'm trying my best to maintain myself an active Facebook presence. I'm not always great about it, but I'm trying to practice what I preach and not be online all the time and do more of the face-to-face thing, but I'm working on it. So I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter, but that's all accessible through my website as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Dr. Aparna Iyer. It's so great to have you on the podcast. We've been talking about loneliness today. I hope you all got a lot out of it. Please feel free to connect with Dr. Iyer, or you can always connect with me at my website, Dianne Ansari-Winn.com. And until next time, we'll be more than happy to see you on the next episode of the Doctor's Life podcast. Until next time, stay happy and healthy. Take care. Thanks for listening today. If you like what you've heard, be sure to hit subscribe in your podcast app so that you won't miss an episode. You can also read show notes, get links, and contact me by going to drdianne.com. That's www.drdianne.com. And docs, while you're there, take the Physician Vitality Assessment, which will help you more clearly see if you are at risk for burnout.